If you've ever wondered whether your bank account is keeping pace with everyone else your age, today's video is going to give you an honest answer, and the numbers might surprise you more than you expect. We're breaking down net worth by age across America in 2026, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly where you stand compared to people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, plus what separates the people who are pulling ahead from everyone else who feels stuck. Before we dive in, if you find this kind of breakdown useful, take a second to subscribe to the channel, because we're covering money and wealth topics like this every single week, and hitting that notification bell means you won't miss the videos that could genuinely shift how you think about your own finances. And if you've got a guess about where you think you'll land before we get into the numbers, drop it in the comments, because it's always interesting to see how close people's expectations come to reality. So let's start with the basics, because net worth is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but it's worth being clear about what it actually means. Net worth is simply everything you own, minus everything you owe. Your savings, your retirement accounts, your home equity, your investments, your car, all of that gets added up on one side. Then your debts, your credit cards, your student loans, your mortgage, your car payments, all of that gets subtracted. What's left is your net worth, and it's generally considered the most honest snapshot of someone's financial health. Far more telling than just looking at their salary or their job title. Now, let's talk about people in their 20s, because this is often where the picture looks the most discouraging, and there's a good reason for that. According to recent data compiled from sources like the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the median net worth for Americans under 30 tends to sit in a fairly modest range, often somewhere between a few $1,000s and around $20,000, though this can vary depending on the specific study and year. A meaningful portion of people in this age bracket actually have a negative net worth, mainly because of student loan debt that hasn't been paid down yet, combined with limited time in the workforce to build up savings or investments. If you're in your 20s and feeling behind, it's worth remembering that this stage is typically about laying groundwork rather than seeing big numbers, and that's completely normal. Moving into the 30s, the picture starts to shift, though not dramatically for most people. This is the decade where many Americans are juggling competing priorities, things like buying a first home, possibly starting a family, and trying to pay down remaining debt from their 20s. Median net worth in this age range tends to climb into the tens of thousands, sometimes reported in studies as somewhere between $30,000 and $70,000, though again, these figures shift depending on the source and the specific year the data was collected. What's interesting about this decade is the widening gap between the median and the average. The average net worth tends to be pulled much higher by a smaller group of high earners and aggressive investors, while the median, which represents the middle of the pack, stays much more modest. That gap is actually one of the clearest signs of how wealth inequality shows up, even within a single age group. By the time people reach their 40s, something important starts happening for those who've been consistent. This is typically the decade where compound growth on retirement accounts starts to become noticeable, assuming someone has been contributing steadily. Median net worth for this age group often falls somewhere in the range of $60,000 to over $100,000, according to various financial surveys. This is also frequently the peak earning decade for many careers, but it's worth noting that it's also when expenses tend to peak too. Things like mortgages, children's expenses, and sometimes supporting aging parents all hit at once. So even though income may be higher, net worth growth can still feel slower than expected, because so much is going out the door at the same time it's coming in. Now we get to the 50s, and this is where the data starts to show some of the widest variation between people who planned ahead and people who didn't. This is generally considered a critical decade for retirement preparation, since there are only so many working years left to build a cushion. Median net worth for people in their 50s is often reported somewhere in the range of $100,000 to $200,000, though plenty of individual situations fall well outside that range in either direction. This is also typically when home equity becomes a much larger piece of someone's overall net worth, especially for people who bought property years earlier and have watched values appreciate. If you're in this decade right now, it's worth taking stock honestly, because the choices made here often determine how comfortable the next stage of life will be. When we look at the 60s and beyond, the numbers generally peak, which makes sense given decades of saving, investing, and paying down debt. Median net worth for people in their 60s is frequently reported somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000 in various surveys, though high earners and long-term investors in this group can have net worth figures many times higher than that median. This is also the decade where people start drawing down assets rather than building them up, since retirement typically begins somewhere in this range, which means net worth growth tends to slow or even decline gradually as savings get used for living expenses. So now that we've gone through the brackets, where does that leave you? If you're below the median for your age group, take a breath, because these numbers represent averages and medians pulled from broad national data, and your personal situation, your location, your industry, and your specific choices all play a role that a single statistic can't capture. What matters more than comparing yourself to a chart is understanding the patterns that separate people who build wealth steadily from people who stay stuck, regardless of age. One of the clearest patterns researchers consistently point to is the power of starting early, even with small amounts. Someone who begins investing modestly in their 20s, even just putting away a small percentage of their income consistently, tends to end up significantly ahead of someone who starts in their 30s or 40s with larger amounts, purely because of how much longer their money has to grow. Time in the market tends to matter more than the size of the initial investment, which is honestly one of the more encouraging things about this whole conversation, because it means the decade you start matters less than simply starting at all. Another pattern that shows up again and again is the role of debt management. People who keep high-interest debt, particularly credit card debt, hanging around for years tend to see their net worth growth stalled significantly, because interest charges essentially cancel out whatever progress they're making elsewhere. On the flip side, people who aggressively pay down high-interest debt early, even if it means slower investing in the short term, often end up with healthier net worth trajectories over time, simply because they're not bleeding money to interest payments every single month. Housing also plays an outsized role in how net worth develops over a lifetime, more than most people realize. Homeowners, on average, tend to report significantly higher net worth than renters of the same age, largely because mortgage payments build equity over time while rent payments don't build anything for the person paying them. That said, this isn't a universal rule, and there are plenty of cases where renting and investing the difference outperforms buying, depending on the market and the specific numbers involved, so it's worth running your own calculations rather than assuming one path is automatically better. There's also a behavioral pattern worth mentioning, which is consistency. People who build meaningful net worth over time tend to share one trait more than almost anything else, and that's simply continuing to invest and save through market downturns, job changes, and economic uncertainty, rather than stopping or panic selling when things get rocky. The people who pulled their money out during downturns and waited for things to feel safe again before reinvesting often missed the recovery entirely, while those who stayed consistent generally came out ahead once markets stabilized. If there's one takeaway from looking at these numbers across every age group, it's that net worth isn't really about hitting some magic number by a specific birthday. It's about the trajectory, the direction things are heading, and whether your habits today are setting you up for a stronger position 5 or 10 years from now. Someone with a modest net worth in their 30s who's saving consistently and avoiding high-interest debt is often in a far better long-term position than someone with a slightly higher net worth who's living paycheck to paycheck despite a good income. So wherever you land on these brackets today, the more useful question isn't, am I ahead or behind? It's, am I moving in the right direction? If this video gave you a clearer picture of where you stand and what actually moves the needle, do me a favor and hit that like button, since it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who could use this kind of breakdown. And if you've got thoughts on where you fall, or questions about any of these age brackets, drop a comment below, because I read through them, and they often shape what we cover next. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch the next video, where we're going to break down exactly how much you need saved at each age to retire comfortably. And trust me, that number might surprise you even more than this one did. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.